"Sarah, what can we even offer Dorcas for? I think a bag of rice should be enough." "Ah, perfect." She turned to Caleb, barely holding back her laughter. "You heard my daughter. If you can afford a bag of rice, Dorcas is yours. That's all she's worth." The next evening, Caleb returned with a bag of rice, big, heavy, the best brand. He placed it before Anita, his face unreadable. He didn't try to prove anything to any of them, just what they thought he could afford. Anita grinned, clapping her hands together. "Ah, a deal is a deal." She grabbed Dorcas by the wrist and shoved her forward. "Here, take your wife. May you both live in hunger and poverty forever." Dorcas stood silently, watching it all unfold. This was her life, nothing more than a joke to them, a thing to be traded for food. You can grab your coffee or popcorn, sit back, and enjoy this captivating journey. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, and drop a comment on this video. That afternoon, some hours after the midwife had arrived, the house was filled with the cries of a newborn. But there was no laughter, no celebration, just silence, the kind that suffocates the soul. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the tiny, beautiful baby girl wrapped in soft white cloth. His heart shattered into pieces, yet there was no time to mourn. He had to be strong. Strong for his child. The air in the bedroom grew thicker with panic. Shadows danced on the walls as the midwife worked frantically, her voice a tight whisper of urgency. A cold sweat clung to Amanda's trembling skin. The walls blurred. Her voice faded. And then, silence. A wail pierced the night, sharp and pure. A newborn's cry. A life beginning, as another faded. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the room. A perfect baby wrapped in soft white cloth. She was beautiful, fragile, innocent. Yet the woman who had given her life was gone. The room was still. No laughter, no cheers. Only a grief so heavy it could crush his soul. Marcus staggered, his knees nearly buckling. His heart cracked, but he had no time to fall apart. No time to mourn. He had to be strong, for his child. He was broken for the love he had just lost. But grief has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. And as the days turned into weeks, Marcus realized something. This was just the beginning of his story. Grief clung to Marcus like a shadow. The weight of Amanda's absence was unbearable, but each time he looked into the eyes of his newborn daughter, Dorcas, he found a reason to keep going. She had Amanda's nose, her soft curls, and something else, a quiet strength that made him believe he could survive this loss. But raising a baby alone was harder than he ever imagined. Every night, the cries of his daughter echoed through the house, and Marcus, exhausted and broken, held her close, whispering promises. "I will never let you suffer. I will protect you, always." He meant every word of his promises. For a while, things got better. His mother stepped in to help, holding Dorcas in her arms like she was a piece of Amanda that had returned. The house smelled of warm soup again. Laughter, though grief, found its way through the cracks of their sorrow. But happiness never stayed long in Marcus' life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, his mother called him to her bedside. Her once strong hands trembled. "My son, you need a wife," she whispered. "Dorcas will need a mother. You will need someone to care for you." Marcus shook his head. "No, mother. Amanda was the only one for me." His mother sighed. "Life does not ask for permission to move forward, Marcus. One day, you will see." And then, just like Amanda, she was gone. Cold, looking sad, her face stiff like that of a stranger who never smiled at him. Grief struck Marcus once again, but this time, there was no one left to catch him. He had lost everything: his wife, his mother, his peace. Only Dorcas remained, watching him with big, innocent eyes, completely unaware that her father's world had shattered. As time passed, Marcus realized something painful. He was alone, drowning in sorrow, and his mother had been right. He needed help. He needed someone to care for Dorcas, to bring warmth back into his house. So, with a heavy heart, he made a decision he hoped he would never regret. He took a new wife in. Her name was Anita. At first, she was everything he needed. She was gentle and kind to Dorcas, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find happiness again. But happiness, as Marcus had learned, never lasted long. Anita was everything Marcus had hoped for. She had a way of making the house feel warm again, like a candle glowing in a dark room. She smiled at Dorcas, held her tiny hands, and whispered sweet words that made the little girl laugh. Marcus watched her closely, studying the way she cared for his daughter, and with each passing day, he allowed himself to believe that maybe love could be found twice in a lifetime. She cooked meals that filled the house with the smell of roasted peppers and fresh herbs, making it feel like home again. When Anita became pregnant, Marcus was overjoyed, but something shifted, a quiet change, so small at first that it barely seemed real. It started with little things. Dorcas' clothes suddenly disappeared from the laundry pile, her food portions got smaller, and the bedtime stories Anita once read to her became less frequent. Marcus noticed but pushed the thoughts away. He convinced himself he was imagining things. After all, Anita had once been kind, hadn't she? He murmured to himself one afternoon. Then, Dorcas turned 3, and what was once a small shift became an undeniable truth. Anita no longer saw her as a daughter. Her once loving voice turned sharp, her warm hands became cold, and her eyes, once filled with affection, now held something else, indifference. All her love, all her attention, belonged to her newborn baby, Sarah. Marcus, now weaker from a lingering sickness, could see what was happening, but what could he do? He could barely stand without gasping for air, and every day, he grew thinner, his strength fading like a dying flame. He wanted to fight for his daughter, but he was no longer the man he used to be. And so, Anita ruled the house, and under her rule, Dorcas became invisible. The girl who once laughed at bedtime stories now sat in the shadows, watching as her stepmother poured all her love into another child. She wasn't allowed to cry, not when Sarah had something she didn't, not when she was told she wasn't good enough, not even when she was sent to bed hungry while the others ate. "Your father left nothing for you," Anita would say. "I feed you out of kindness. Remember that." Marcus hated it. He hated the way his daughter was treated, he hated the way his house no longer felt like home. But sickness had stolen his power, and sickness had stolen his voice. He tried to speak up, but Anita silenced him with sharp words and sharper looks. And then, one day, Marcus closed his eyes and never opened them again after Anita took him in his wheelchair into the bathroom and brought him out in silence. Dorcas, now 12 years old, stood at her father's grave, her tiny hands clenched into fists. She wasn't crying. Not because she wasn't sad, but because she knew her tears wouldn't matter. No one would care. And as she turned back to the house that no longer felt like hers, she realized something. She was completely alone. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison. A place where Dorcas' name was only called when there was work to do. Where her hands were always busy but never held anything to her mouth. Where her voice was ignored unless it was to beg for mercy. Her father's death had sealed her fate. The mornings smelled of fresh bread and spiced tea, but none of it was for her. Instead, she scrubbed the floors, her fingers raw from the soapy water, while Anita and Sarah dined in comfort. Their laughter echoed through the house like a cruel melody. By noon, the sun would beat down mercilessly, but Dorcas was still on her feet, washing and ironing their clothes with no rest, no break. She wasn't a daughter anymore, she was a servant in her own home. But hunger was the worst of it. It chewed her stomach like an angry beast, twisting and turning, making her hands weak and her head light. She wasn't allowed to eat until Anita and Sarah were full, and by then, there was barely anything left. Some days, she had only scraps, and on others, just water. The smell of grilled fish and sizzling meat filled the air, torturing her senses, making her mouth water, but she knew better than to ask for more. Asking meant punishment. Asking meant pain. Yet, even hunger was nothing compared to the cruelty of her own blood. Sarah, now 9 years old, had learned well from her mother. She didn't see Dorcas as a sister, she saw her as a toy. A toy to order around, a toy to mock. She would spill her own food and blame Dorcas for it, knowing her mom would believe her. She would throw fits for nothing until Dorcas was punished, watching with delight as her older sister was slapped and beaten with a belt. She laughed when Dorcas cried. But Dorcas had learned something too. Crying never helped. So, she swallowed her pain. She carried the weight of her suffering in silence, her heart growing colder with every passing day. She spoke less. She dreamed less. The girl who once laughed in her father's arms was now just a quiet figure, moving from one chore to another, waiting for the next order, the next insult, the next slap. And then, one day, something inside her broke. It happened when she watched Sarah get dressed for school, her uniform crisp, her shoes polished, her books neatly packed. Dorcas wanted to go too. She wanted to sit in a classroom, hold a pen, and learn things beyond how to cook and clean. But when she asked, Anita would only laugh. School? For you. Anita scoffed, her voice sharp like broken glass. You are lucky you even eat in this house. Do you want education too? Who will pay for it? Your dead father. Sarah laughed with her mother, shaking her head. You should be grateful, Dorcas. At least you have a roof over your head. But if you keep dreaming nonsense, you might lose even that. That was the moment Dorcas realized something. She would never be free here. Not as long as Anita and Sarah ruled this house. She had two choices, stay and die a little more each day, or find a way out. And for the first time she chose herself. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But one day, somehow, she would escape. Now she moved like a shadow, never too loud, never too slow. But inside, she was screaming. She wanted more. Not riches, not luxury, just a chance to be something more than a servant in her own home. Her escape seemed impossible until she met Caleb. Caleb was the waste collector in the estate, a boy with tired hands and bright eyes, always carrying the smell of burning trash and fresh air at the same time. He was different from anyone Dorcas had ever known. He didn't look at her with pity or cruelty. He looked at her like she mattered. It started small. A smile. A nod. A quick conversation while she was outside, taking in the only fresh air she was allowed. Then, it turned into friendship. Caleb would slip her little things, a piece of bread, a wrapped candy, sometimes just a kind word. Dorcas had never been given anything without a price before, and this scared her. One afternoon, Caleb came to see her, but his eyes were not on her. They were on Sarah. Tell me about Sarah, your sister, he asked, his voice filled with hope. What does she like? Dorcas' heart twisted at that moment. This was her friend. Her only friend. And now, he wanted Sarah, who had never known suffering, who had never gone a day without food, who had everything Dorcas had only dreamed of. Still, she smiled. She told him what he wanted to hear. She painted Sarah as someone kind, someone gentle. A girl Caleb could love. But Dorcas knew the truth. Sarah wasn't kind, at all. Sarah wasn't gentle for a minute. And when Caleb finally told her how he felt about Sarah, Dorcas knew exactly how this story would end. Dorcas knew Sarah would not just reject Caleb, she would destroy his inner peace, with words that could delay his destiny. She wanted to warn him, to shake him, maybe tell him that Sarah was nothing like the kind girl he imagined. But who was she to ruin someone else's dream? Dreams were fragile things, and Dorcas had learned that some people would rather have their dreams broken by the world than be told the truth. So she watched in silence and helpless, as Caleb gathered his courage. The sun hung low in the sky that evening, golden light spilling across the estate like a painting, as he approached Sarah. Dorcas stood far, her hands clenched into fists, waiting for the moment she had already seen coming. Caleb's waste truck was packed just by the gate, like a wheelchair waiting for him to return with crippled legs. Caleb cleared his throat, his face almost welling out sweat. "Hi," he said. Sarah listened, her eyes a bit wide, knowing she had no business with a waste collector. "My name is Caleb, nice to meet you. Have been looking for a moment like this, for just you and I at least to hear your voice." Then, she laughed. The kind of laugh that wasn't real, the kind that curled in mockery, sharp like the edge of a knife. Caleb's hopeful expression trembled, but he pushed forward, telling her how he felt, his words stumbling but sincere. Dorcas wanted to look away, but she couldn't. Then, it happened. Sarah slapped him so hard that the sound cracked through the air like thunder. His right eye at that moment took time to see the setting sun. Dorcas jumped. The world seemed to hold its breath as Sarah took a step forward, her voice laced with disgust. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "Do I look like someone who would even breathe the same air as a filthy waste collector?" She spat at his feet, her face twisted in anger. "Don't ever speak to me again. In fact, stay far away from me and my family." Dorcas felt something inside her snapped. Caleb stood frozen, humiliated, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists on his face. She had broken him. The same way Dorcas had been broken over and over again. But unlike her, Caleb wasn't used to pain. This was his first taste of rejection, and it burned him. Before Dorcas could step in, someone else did. A car had pulled up nearby, its engine purring softly, sleek and black, like something that didn't belong in their world. Ferrari. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Not old, not too young, but with the kind of presence that made people pay attention to him. He walked towards them slowly, taking in the scene. His gaze flickered from Caleb, still stunned, to Sarah, still fuming, and then, unexpectedly, to Dorcas. Dorcas stiffened. Something about the way he looked at her felt strange, like he saw something no one else ever had. Then, he turned back to Sarah. "What's going on here?" His voice was smooth, like the calm before a storm. Sarah smiled immediately, flipping her hair to her back, her entire demeanor shifting. "Oh, nothing important. Just a beggar who thought he could speak to me." The man's lips twitched, almost like he wanted to laugh. But he didn't. Instead, he turned back to Caleb, offering a hand. "Don't let rejection make you smaller," he said. "You deserve better." And just like that, everything changed. Sarah, however, was less impressed. She flipped her hair, her lips curling in a smirk. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, crossing her arms. Her tone was sharp, but there was something else hidden beneath it. Curiosity. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, then Caleb. Then, he finally spoke. "Justice." One word. No explanation. Just a name. But it was enough to make Sarah straighten her posture, smoothing down her dress as if trying to impress him. Justice turned back to Caleb. "You work as a waste collector, right?" Caleb nodded, his face still burning with embarrassment. "Yeah, it's a job." Justice smiled faintly. "A job is just a job. A man is more than the work he does." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a black golden business card. "Come see me tomorrow. Maybe you deserve more than just collecting trash." Sarah gasped dramatically. "Wait, you are giving him a job?" she asked, laughing like it was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. "He literally smells like garbage." Justice didn't even look at her. Smell washes off. Bad character doesn't. The smooth way he moved, the confidence in his voice, Justice was clearly someone with power. Exactly the kind of man she deserved. When he turned to leave, Sarah acted fast. "I feel like we have met before." Justice finally looked at her. "Have we?" His voice was cool, unreadable. But that only made Sarah more interested. She was used to men tripping over themselves for her. Sarah laughed, resting her manicured hand lightly on his arm. "Maybe not. But we should. Bills on me." Justice smirked. "Interesting." That was all Sarah needed. He was captivated. She could feel it. And just like that, the game began. As Justice walked away, Sarah turned to Dorcas with a victorious grin. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her eyes gleaming. "That man is mine." Dorcas said nothing. She just watched as Justice disappeared down the street in his black sleek car. Justice was different from the men who had chased her before. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't predictable. And most importantly, he wasn't poor. He had money, power, presence, exactly what she wanted in a man. She spent the next few weeks doing what she did best, making herself irresistible. Every time Justice visited, she dressed to impress him, her perfume lingering in the air long after she walked past. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm lightly, and played the game perfectly. And slowly, Justice began to respond. Their phone calls became longer. The visits became more frequent. He started bringing her gifts, simple at first, then expensive. A gold bracelet. A designer purse. Even Anita was impressed. "You have caught a big fish," she whispered one night, her eyes gleaming as they watched Justice that evening from their window. "Make sure you don't let him go." And Sarah didn't plan to let him go either. The evening air was thick with the smell of burning wood and distant rain, a storm waiting to happen. Caleb had no business coming back here, but he did. As usual, he pulled his cart to the gate, waiting for the waste to be brought out. He didn't have to do this himself anymore, not after getting a better job through Justice. But tonight, he came for something else. Anita was the first to see him. She was hanging out on the front porch, sipping from a cold glass of juice, her expensive rings glinting under the dim evening light. Her face twisted into disgust the moment she recognized him. "And what do we owe this grand visit, waste boy?" she sneered. Before Caleb could speak, Sarah stormed out. She looked furious, her silk robe flowing behind her as she walked. Her face was twisted in frustration, her hands flying as she spoke. "Mummy, I have had enough of this. Caleb has been stalking me." Caleb stiffened. "Stalking you?" Sarah folded her arms, her lips curling. "Everywhere I go, you show up. When I step outside, you are there. When I turn to a corner, there you are again. It's pathetic. I can't even breathe in my own home because of you." Anita, now thoroughly entertained, laughed loudly. "Ah, Caleb, is this true?" She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with wicked amusement. "Do you think my daughter is in your league?" Caleb clenched his fists. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to chase. But before he could speak, Anita went in for the kill. She stood up, smoothed down her dress, and looked him over slowly, deliberately. "You are a waste collector. You live for dirt, you work in filth, and you stink of poverty." She took a slow sip of her juice and smirked. "My daughter, on the other hand, is meant for greatness." Sarah smiled at her mother's words, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Exactly," she scoffed. "You have no shame, Caleb. If you are looking for a wife, look at your level." Then, Anita turned and shouted toward the house. "Dorcas, come outside." A moment later, Dorcas stepped into their view, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She looked at the scene, confused. Anita grinned. "If you want a woman so badly, Caleb, take her." She flicked a hand toward Dorcas as if offering scraps to a stray dog. "Maybe you two can join forces and pack all the waste in the city. Who knows? You might even build an empire out of garbage." Sarah burst into laughter. The sound was sharp and cruel, cutting through the evening air like glass breaking. Caleb looked at Dorcas. Dorcas looked at Caleb. And something inside both of them shifted. Dorcas wasn't laughing. She wasn't even flinching. And Caleb, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Because this wasn't an insult. This was fate setting things into place. And neither Anita nor Sarah had any idea what they had just done. They had mocked Caleb so much that tears almost ran from their eyes. But when the laughter finally died down, Anita leaned forward with an amused smirk. "Sarah, what can we even offer Dorcas for?" she mused, twirling her bracelet around her wrist. Sarah pretended to think, tapping a manicured finger against her chin. Then, with a wicked grin, she snapped her fingers. "I think a bag of rice." Anita gasped dramatically. "Ah, perfect." She turned to Caleb, barely holding back her laughter. "You heard my daughter. If you can afford a bag of rice, Dorcas is yours. That's what she's worth. After all, nothing good has ever come out of her." Dorcas stood silently, watching it all unfold. This was her life, a joke to them, a thing to be traded for food. But before she could react, Caleb stepped forward. His voice was calm and steady. "I will take her." The laughter stopped. Sarah and Anita blinked. For a moment, it seemed like the world had tilted, as if they hadn't expected him to actually say yes. But Caleb wasn't done. He turned to Dorcas, his voice softer now. "I took the wrong path, Dorcas. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was lost." He swallowed hard. "You were always the one. And I see that now." Dorcas stared at him. The man who had once longed for Sarah was now standing before her, choosing her, not out of pity, not out of desperation, but because he saw her worth. For the first time in her life, someone wanted her. And she chose to believe him. "I will marry you." Anita scoffed, rolling her eyes. "What a love story," she mocked. "Just bring the bag of rice." The next evening, Caleb returned with a bag of rice, big, heavy, the best brand. He placed it before Anita, his face unreadable. He didn't even try to prove himself to any of them, just what they thought he could afford. Anita grinned, clapping her hands together. "Ah, a deal is a deal." She grabbed Dorcas by the wrist and shoved her forward. "Here, take your wife. May you both live in hunger and poverty forever." Sarah, standing beside her mother, simply smirked. "Enjoy your life of collecting waste," she sneered. Dorcas said nothing. She simply stepped beside Caleb, and together, they walked away. Days turned into weeks. Sarah waited for Justice to visit as usual. She dressed up, made sure her perfume lingered in the air, and waited by the window like a princess expecting her prince. But he never came. His calls stopped. His messages stopped. It was as if he had vanished. At first, she convinced herself he was just busy. Then, she tried calling, but his number was unreachable. Panic set in. Months later, Anita's business collapsed. One bad decision after another, driven by greed, led her into financial ruin. The sugar boy she had been seeing stole her last investment and disappeared. She was drowning in debt. And when all else failed, she did the unthinkable. She called Sarah. "Call your husband," she demanded. "Tell him we need help." But Sarah could only stare at her phone, the dial tone ringing endlessly. Justice's number was no longer available. The man she had wanted, the one she had planned to trap down, was gone. And the man she had mocked was now the one in power. The girl they called worthless now owned everything. Karma had arrived, and it had no mercy. One evening, while walking through the most expensive part of the estate, Sarah froze. A sleek black car pulled up, one she recognized instantly. And stepping out of it was Justice. Her heart leapt with relief until she saw where he was standing. In front of Caleb's house. But that made no sense. Why was Justice here? Why was he standing beside a man like Caleb, smiling? Then, the door opened. Dorcas stepped out of the car. And that was when her world shattered. Caleb wasn't poor. He wasn't a waste collector. He was a billionaire. The house wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. Expensive cars lined the driveway. The yard stretched wide and perfect. And at the center of it all, stood Caleb, now dressed in crisp, designer clothes, looking every bit the powerful man he truly was. Sarah couldn't breathe. "How?" Justice turned to her, smiling slightly. Surprised. Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Justice sighed, shaking his head. "You thought Caleb was a waste collector because that's what he wanted you to believe. He wanted to see who truly cared for him, who could love him without knowing his wealth." He turned to Caleb. And Dorcas did. Dorcas looked at Sarah, but there was no malice in her eyes. No revenge. Just quiet strength. Sarah's stomach twisted. Justice continued. "Caleb owns the estate you live in, Sarah. Every single house, every building, including the one your mother mocks people from. The only reason you are still there is because he hasn't thrown you out yet." Sarah felt her legs weaken. Caleb looked at her finally. "I chased you once," he said simply. "I thought you were everything. But I see now. I was blind." He turned to Dorcas, and his eyes softened. "I found my home." And just like that, Sarah lost everything. The world has a way of humbling the proud. At first, Anita and Sarah refused to believe it. That Justice, the man Sarah had been so desperate to trap down, had been nothing more than a driver in disguise. A man who had never truly cared for her, never planned to marry her, and never even looked back after playing his role in Caleb's plan. But the truth was a bitter pill. And swallowing it was only the beginning of their downfall. Then came the eviction notice. Their rent had expired. For the first time, Sarah and Anita were forced to face reality. The grand house they had flaunted, the comfort they had enjoyed, was never theirs. Sarah stormed to the estate office, her heart racing. She demanded answers, demanded to know why her rent wasn't being covered like before. The man at the desk barely glanced at her. "This house belongs to Mr. Caleb. If you have complaints, take them up with him." Sarah felt her throat tighten. The same man she had mocked, humiliated, and spat on owned the very roof over her head. But the worst was yet to come. The police arrived. Anita had long forgotten about her former sugar boy, the one she had trusted and given everything to. But he hadn't forgotten her. He had used her identity, used her business reputation to sell fake properties, launder money, and forge documents. And now, the law has come knocking. Anita collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "It has to be a mistake." But the officers didn't care for her tears. They went to him. Of course, they went to him. The same man they had mocked, criticized, traded for a bag of rice. They called his phone, again and again. Caleb never answered. Then, one morning, Anita and Sarah stood outside Caleb's mansion. Desperate, humiliated, empty. They were finally let in, guided through halls more luxurious than they had ever dreamed. And at the center of it all, sat Dorcas. No longer a maid. No longer a beggar. She sat beside Caleb, her hands resting on her belly, pregnant with the child of the man they had once called worthless. Anita's lips trembled. "Dorcas, please. We have nowhere else to go." Dorcas was silent for a long time. Then, Caleb spoke. "Everything I own belongs to my wife." His eyes met Dorcas, warm and unshaken. "If she wants to help you, it's up to her." The room fell into dead silence. Anita turned desperately to Dorcas. Sarah, who had once spoken with pride, who had once laughed at Dorcas' pain, was now speechless. Dorcas slowly stood up. She looked at the mother and daughter who had stolen her childhood, turned her into a slave, and mocked her dreams. Then, with a small smile, she simply said, "You will be fine. After all, you both are strong women. The past is gone, the future is here." And with that, the last door closed. Sarah and Anita lose everything. Dorcas, once treated like nothing, now holds all the power. She chooses to walk away. No revenge. No hatred. Just fate delivering the final lesson. The once powerful were now powerless. And Dorcas? She walked into the future they swore she would never have. Justice was never rich. He was Caleb's loyal driver all along.